She never imagined that the sound of her own son's laughter would turn into the knife that pierced her heart. But it did, standing in front of that dark, varnished wooden door, her wrinkled hands trembling on the worn purse that had belonged to her mother, while she listened to how Robert, her little Robbie, the boy she had carried in her arms for miles under the scorching sun in rural Kentucky, the son she had fed on cornbread and stew when they barely had enough to eat, was laughing at her with his colleagues on the other side. The voice was unmistakable, deep and confident, the same one that used to tell her, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to buy you a beautiful house." But now it was saying, "Imagine this. She comes here thinking I have time for her old lady problems, as if I don't have important cases to handle." The heart of hope. Stevens skipped a beat for a moment, or at least that's how it felt, as if all the oxygen in the world had been sucked out of her lungs in one sudden gasp. She had climbed 4 flights of stairs because she didn't understand how the elevator worked in this modern building in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, a place where she clearly didn't belong, with her worn sandals and her shawl faded by the years. She had rehearsed over and over in her mind what she would say to her son, the exact words she would use to ask him for help, to explain that she was sick, that the doctors at the public hospital had given her barely 6 months if she didn't have surgery, and that the operation cost more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes working cleaning houses. But now, with her legs turned to jelly and her eyes burning with tears she couldn't afford to shed there, in that elegant hallway where anyone could see her, she understood something terrible. She had raised a stranger. "And why didn't you just tell her not to come?" asked another male voice from the other side of the door, followed by more muffled laughter. "Oh, man, because then she starts to cry and makes me feel guilty," Robert replied in a tone that mixed annoyance and amusement. "You know how small-town mothers are, so dramatic, always with their stories of sickness and need. Last week she needed money for the gas tank, before that to fix the leak in her house. It's a never-ending story. That's why I just told my secretary to tell her I was in an important meeting to come back another day. Hopefully she'll get tired and stop coming." Hope closed her eyes and leaned against the cold wall of the hallway. 73 years of life, and she had never felt a pain like this. Not even when her husband, Tom, died in the fields 12 years ago, crushed by the old tractor he was trying to fix so he wouldn't have to spend money on the mechanic. Not even when she had to sell the only 2 chickens they owned just to buy Robert's school books. Not even during those endless nights when she went to bed hungry so her son could eat a full plate. This pain was different. It was the pain of seeing that all her sacrifice, her entire life dedicated to a single purpose, giving that boy a better future, had created someone who now saw her as a shameful burden. Before continuing with this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like, so more people can hear stories that touch the soul. Tell us also in the comments what city and state you are watching this video from. Your message brings us closer than you imagine. The hallway began to spin slightly. Hope clung to the strap of her purse as if it were the only thing keeping her connected to the ground. She could taste the metallic flavor of shock in her mouth, that taste she had known before, when bad things happened and the body simply didn't know how to react. Her knees threatened to buckle, but something inside her, perhaps the same stubborn pride that had kept her standing through so many storms, wouldn't let her fall right there on that gleaming marble floor that probably cost more than her entire house in Remedy Springs, Arkansas. The laughter continued on the other side of the door. Hope took a step back, then another, her sandals making a soft sound against the floor, almost inaudible, as if even in that moment of total devastation, she was still trying not to bother, not to take up space, not to be a problem. That's how it had always been. The invisible woman who worked until her hands bled, who prayed silently in the town church every Sunday, who smiled even when she was breaking into 1,000 pieces inside. When she reached the elevator, a young woman in a grey suit and heels that clicked, clicked, clicked against the floor looked her up and down with an expression of slight distaste, as if hope were something dirty that had stained the elegant building. "Are you lost, ma'am?" she asked with a forced politeness that failed to disguise the disdain in her eyes. Hope shook her head, unable to form words. The woman pressed the elevator button and stepped inside when the doors opened, leaving Hope alone again in that hallway that seemed to be shrinking around her. She couldn't get in the elevator. She didn't trust that metal box that moved by itself. So she headed for the stairs, descending slowly, step by step, with one hand clinging to the railing while the other held her chest, where her heart ached in a way no doctor could diagnose with their machines and tests. This pain wouldn't show up on any X-ray. It was the kind of pain that kills slowly, from the inside, starting with the soul, and spreading until every cell in the body feels it. She had arrived in Chicago on a bus that left her town at 4 in the morning. 6 hours of travel on uncomfortable seats, with an empty stomach because she had used the breakfast money to buy some flowers, white gardenias, Robert's favourites when he was a child, which she was now still uselessly carrying in her purse. She had rehearsed her speech throughout the trip, imagining how her son would hug her, how he would tell her not to worry, that he would take care of everything, that she was his mum and he would always look out for her. How naive she had been. As she went down the 3rd floor, a memory struck her with the force of lightning. Robert was 7 years old. They had gone to the town market together, and he had seen a soccer ball at one of the stalls, a simple plastic ball, nothing special, but to him it was the most marvelous object in the universe. "Mum, can you buy it for me?" he had asked with those big eyes, full of hope. Hope had checked her coin purse. She barely had enough to buy the tomatoes and onions they needed for the week. If she bought the ball, they would have to eat only tortillas and salt for several days. "Son, I don't have it right now," she had replied, and the disappointment in Robert's eyes had been like a dagger. But then the boy had done something she would never forget. He had taken her wrinkled hand in his soft little hands and said, "It doesn't matter, Mum. When I'm big and have lots of money, I'll buy you everything you want, and you'll never have to worry about anything again. I promise." That promise had been the light that guided Hope through the darkest years. When she worked 14 hours a day cleaning the houses of rich people in St. Louis, when her hands cracked and bled from the chlorine and detergents, when her back hurt so much she could barely get out of bed, when she had to sell the only gold watch her mother had bequeathed her to pay for Robert's private high school tuition, when she had to go live with her sister Ruby because she had to sell her own house to pay for his college in the city. Every sacrifice had a purpose. So Robert wouldn't go hungry like she did, so he would have an education, so he would become somebody. And she had succeeded. Oh yes, she had succeeded. Robert Stevens was now a successful lawyer with an elegant office in one of the most expensive areas of Chicago, with suits that probably cost more than everything Hope had earned in a year, with a brand new car parked in the building, with a wife who came from a wealthy family and had never had to wash her own clothes. But in that success, Hope had lost her son. When she reached the 1st floor, she had to sit on one of the lobby benches. Her legs were trembling so badly she didn't trust them to hold her up until the exit. A security guard watched her with curiosity, probably wondering what a woman like her was doing in a building like that. Hope closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to organize her thoughts, to make sense of what she had just experienced. When had it happened? When exactly had her little Robbie, the child who used to climb onto her lap so she could tell him stories before bed, transformed into that cold man who laughed at her with his friends? Had it been gradual, like the wearing away of a stone by water, Or had there been a specific moment when the change occurred? Hope remembered the last time Robert had come to visit her in town. It had been almost 2 years ago. He had arrived in his new car, shiny and ostentatious, which looked completely out of place on the dusty streets of Remedy Springs. His wife, Vanessa, had come with him, but she had stayed in the car almost the whole time, sending texts on her elegant phone and complaining about the heat. Robert had entered Hope's house, the humble little plaster house she had rented after selling hers, and had looked around with an uncomfortable expression, as if he were ashamed for anyone to see him there. "Mum, you should consider moving to St. Louis," he had said, without even sitting down in the chair she had offered him. "This town is too backward. There's no future here." Hope had felt a pang in her chest at those words, but she had tried to understand him. Her son had known another world, a world of opportunities and modernity. It was natural that he would see his hometown with different eyes. "This is my home, son," she had replied softly. "Your roots are here. Your dad was born here. You were born here. Your grandparents are buried here." Robert had sighed impatiently. "Mum, you can't live in the past. You have to think about the future." But he hadn't offered to help her in any concrete way, just empty words and advice that was useless when not accompanied by action. That visit had lasted less than 2 hours. Vanessa had insisted they had to go back to the city because they had an important dinner with some clients. Robert had given Hope $2,000, an amount that was probably insignificant to him, but that represented weeks of work for her, and he had left with promises to return soon that both of them knew he wouldn't keep. And now, sitting on that lobby bench, while the city buzzed outside with its incessant noise and eternal rush, Hope had to face a truth she had been avoiding for years. She had lost her son long before that day. She had lost him the day he decided that his past was something to be ashamed of, that his mother was an uncomfortable reminder of the poverty he had left behind, that humility and sacrifice were weaknesses instead of virtues. The security guard approached her. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked with genuine concern in his voice. He was a young man, perhaps Robert's age, with dark skin and calloused hands, like someone who knew hard work. Hope nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you need me to call someone? Do you have family nearby?" The word family made her tremble. Technically, she had family in this city. She had a son who worked on the 4th floor of that very building, but in reality, she was completely alone. "I'm fine. Thank you," she finally managed to say in a hoarse voice. "I just need a moment." The guard nodded understandingly and returned to his post, but continued to glance at her worriedly from time to time. Hope thanked his kindness in silence. It was curious how a stranger could show more humanity than her own flesh and blood. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, Hope forced herself to stand up. She couldn't stay there forever. She had to go back to the bus terminal. She had to make the long trip back to her town. She had to face her reality. But as she walked towards the building exit, something inside her had broken in a way she knew could never be fully repaired. Chicago hit her with its intensity as soon as she crossed the glass doors. The traffic noise, the smog that irritated her eyes already swollen from contained tears, the crowd running back and forth without looking at anyone, each person locked in their own bubble of urgency and indifference. Hope felt smaller than ever, a dry leaf dragged by a wind that didn't care where it took her. She began to walk aimlessly, her purse clutched against her chest, and the white gardenias now feeling like a dead weight inside it. What would she do with those flowers? Throw them in the first trash can she found? That would seem like a sacrilege after all that buying them had meant, after the anticipation with which she had chosen them that morning at her town's market, imagining Robert's smile upon receiving them. The streets of the Gold Coast were full of elegant stores, with mannequins wearing clothes that cost more than Hope's annual salary, restaurants with menus in languages she couldn't read, beautiful and well-dressed people walking with that confidence that money gives, talking on shiny phones about things that sounded important but probably weren't. Hope felt like a ghost walking among the living, invisible, irrelevant, a relic of an America that no longer existed, or at least didn't exist in that place, in that area of the city where progress had erased any trace of humility or humanity. Her feet took her, without her consciously deciding it, towards Lincoln Park. She had heard of that place in some conversation, years ago, when Robert still called her on the phone occasionally. "It's a beautiful park, Mum," he had said. "Someday I'll take you so you can see it." Another broken promise to add to the list. But now she was there, walking under the leafy trees that offered shade from the relentless midday sun. She found an empty bench and sat down, silently thanking God for that small respite. Life continued normally around her. Young mothers pushed strollers with chubby, happy babies. Couples in love walked hand in hand. Children ran after pigeons that took flight in bursts of grey feathers. And there, in the middle of all that normalcy, Hope Stevens finally allowed herself to cry. They weren't loud or dramatic tears. They were silent tears that slipped down her wrinkled cheeks and fell onto her clasped hands in her lap. She cried for the son she had lost. She cried for all the years of sacrifice that now seemed useless. She cried for the innocence with which she had believed that a mother's love was enough to keep a family together. She cried for the illness growing inside her that would probably kill her because she didn't have the money for the operation, and apparently didn't have a son who would help her either. But more than anything, she cried for the girl she had been so many years ago in that same state of Kentucky, the girl who dreamed of having a happy, united family, of raising good and grateful children, of growing old surrounded by love and respect. That girl could never have imagined she would end up like this, at 73 years old, alone in a hostile city, crying in a park because her only son saw her as a disgrace. "Are you all right, ma'am?" A gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. Hope looked up and saw a young woman, perhaps around 30 years old, with a baby in her arms and an expression of genuine concern on her face. She had the kind of simple, honest beauty that Hope associated with small-town people, although her clothes were modern and well cared for. "Yes, thank you," Hope replied automatically, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. The woman didn't move. She sat down on the bench next to Hope, settling the baby in her lap. "Pardon me for intruding," she said softly, "but my grandmother always said that no one should cry alone, that tears weigh less when someone else sees them." Hope looked at her in surprise. There was something in that woman's warmth that reminded her of her town, of the way people still cared about each other, how a stranger could offer comfort without expecting anything in return. "You're very kind," Hope murmured, "but I don't want to bother you." "It's no bother," the woman replied with a smile. "I'm Carol, and this little one is Matt." The baby was looking at Hope with those big, curious eyes that all children have. Without thinking, Hope extended a wrinkled finger, and the baby grabbed it with his chubby little hand. That simple gesture of innocent trust made something stir in her chest. "Hope," she introduced herself. "Nice to meet you." They remained in silence for a few moments, watching the children play and the pigeons peck the ground, looking for crumbs. Carol didn't pressure her, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. She was just there, a warm presence amidst the cold that Hope felt in her soul. Finally, without knowing quite why, Hope began to speak. Perhaps it was because Carol was a stranger and she would never see her again. Perhaps it was because she had kept so much pain inside for so long that she needed to let it out before it drowned her. Or perhaps it was simply because sometimes, when the world has knocked you down enough, you need the kindness of a stranger to remember that you are still human. "I came to see my son," she said with a trembling voice. "He's a lawyer. He works in an elegant building near here. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. I'm sick. I need an operation. And I thought he would help me." She stopped, swallowing the lump in her throat. "But I heard him talking about me with his colleagues, as if I were a burden, as if I embarrassed him, as if all the years I spent raising him meant nothing." Carol listened without interrupting, her expression softening with empathy. When Hope finished, the young woman took her wrinkled hand in hers. "I am so sorry," she said sincerely. "I can't imagine how painful that must be. But know one thing, Mrs. Hope. The problem is not with you. The problem is with a world that teaches people that success means forgetting where you came from, that money is worth more than gratitude, that appearances matter more than heart." Carol's words resonated in Hope's heart. There was some truth in them, a truth she had felt but hadn't been able to articulate. "I just wanted him to have a better life than mine," she whispered. "Is that wrong?" "Of course not," Carol replied firmly. "That's love. But sometimes, when we give so much to someone, that person forgets the cost of what they received, forgets the sacrifices behind every opportunity. It's not your fault, Ma'am. You did what your heart told you. He is the one who chose to forget." Hope nodded slowly, letting those words sink into her consciousness. They didn't make her feel better, not exactly, but there was a certain comfort in knowing that she wasn't crazy, that her pain was valid, that she had done the right thing, even if the outcome wasn't what she expected. Matt began to fuss in his mother's arms, making those little noises that babies make when they are hungry. Carol stood up. "I have to go," she said with an apologetic smile. "But Mrs. Hope, if you'll allow me to tell you something, you are worth more than your son makes you believe. Your life has value. Your love has value. Your sacrifices have value, even if he doesn't see them." Before leaving, Carol took a small card from her purse. "This is the number for a community health centre," she explained. "My sister-in-law works there. It's not an elegant hospital, but they have programs to help people who need operations and can't afford them. Don't lose hope, okay? There are still good people in this world." Hope took the card with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words seemed insufficient to express the gratitude she felt. Carol gave her a quick but warm hug and then left, pushing Matt's stroller down the park path, leaving Hope with a small ray of light in the darkness her day had been. Hope remained on the bench for a long time after Carol left. She looked at the card she had been given, then looked at the gardenias withering in her purse, and then she made a decision. She wouldn't give up, not for herself, but because giving up would be betraying all the women like her who had fought and suffered and sacrificed in silence. Giving up would be saying that her life didn't matter, that her pain wasn't valid, that it was right for her to be treated like trash. She stood up with difficulty, feeling the weight of her 73 years in every joint. But there was a new determination in her eyes, a spark that had been extinguished but not dead. She began to walk towards the park exit, but this time with a destination in mind. She would find the bus terminal, she would go back to her town, and tomorrow she would call the number on the card Carol had given her. But before leaving Chicago, there was something she needed to do. With slow but determined steps, Hope returned to the building where Robert worked. The same security guard recognized her and greeted her with a respectful nod. Hope smiled briefly at him and walked towards the reception desk. A young woman with too much makeup and a bored expression looked at her listlessly. "How can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she would rather be doing anything else. "I would like to leave something for Mr. Robert Stevens, the lawyer," Hope said with a firm voice. The receptionist sighed as if Hope had asked her to climb a mountain. "What is it?" she asked impatiently. Hope reached into her purse and took out the white gardenias, now a little withered from the heat of the day, but still beautiful in their own way. "These flowers," she said, "and this letter," because during her time in the park, after Carol left, Hope had taken a folded piece of paper from her purse, a paper she always carried with her, and had written with her trembling and poorly educated handwriting, but clearly and from the heart. The letter read, "Robert, my son, I came to find you today because I am sick and I was afraid, but I heard you talking about me, and I understood something. I am no longer your mother in your heart. I am an uncomfortable memory of the past you want to forget. I don't blame you, son. The world taught you that success is more important than love, and perhaps I gave you too much and didn't teach you enough about gratitude. These flowers were for you, to remind you of the ones you used to pick for me when you were a child. But you are not that child anymore, so I leave them here as a final gift, not for you to enjoy, but to remind you, every time you see a white gardenia, that there was once a woman who loved you more than her own life, a woman who sacrificed everything for you, a woman who must now learn to live with a broken heart. I ask nothing more of you, son, only that when I am no longer in this world and someone speaks to you of their mother with love, you remember yours, and perhaps, just perhaps, you feel even a fraction of the pain you caused today. With eternal, though unrequited love, your mother." The receptionist took the flowers and the letter with a slightly puzzled expression, probably catching some of the emotion in Hope's voice, although she didn't fully understand the context. "I will give them to him," she promised in a slightly softer tone. "Thank you," Hope replied, and without looking back, without allowing herself to doubt or regret, she walked towards the building exit for the last time. The afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Hope walked through the city streets, asking for directions from anyone who seemed kind, until she finally found the northern bus station. She bought her return ticket with the little money she had left, thanking heaven that she at least had that. The bus that would take her back to Remedy Springs wouldn't leave for another 3 hours. Hope found a seat in the waiting room, between a young woman breastfeeding her baby and an elderly man dozing with his hat covering his face. The terminal smelled of fried food, diesel, and that particular mixture of tired humanity that characterizes all places of transit. Hope took her rosary out of her purse, a rosary her mother had given her for her first communion, with wooden beads worn smooth by decades of prayers, and began to pray softly, seeking comfort in the familiar words she had repeated thousands of times throughout her life. But for the first time in many years, the prayers felt empty. The words left her lips by pure muscle memory, but her mind was elsewhere, reliving again and again the moment she had heard Robert's laughter, the moment her world had crumbled. She wondered if God truly heard the prayers of old, abandoned women, or if he too was too busy with more important matters. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted her. Hope looked up and saw a boy about 8 or 9 years old, with patched but clean clothes, carefully combed hair, and worn but well-polished shoes. He carried a small basket of candies in his hands. "Would you like to buy some candies? They're tamarind. My mum makes them." His large, dark eyes looked at her with a mixture of hope and shyness. Hope felt her heart clench. The boy reminded her so much of Robert at that age, when he too had tried to sell things at the market to help with household expenses. He had sold oranges, chewing gum, whatever he could, always with that determination to contribute, not to be a burden. When had he changed? At what point had that hard-working, humble boy turned into the man who was ashamed of his background? "Of course, son," Hope replied, taking some coins from her purse, even though she knew she shouldn't spend another cent more than necessary. "Give me 3. The boy's face lit up with a smile that was worth more than all the gold in the world. He handed her 3 tamarind candies, carefully wrapped in cellophane, and took the coins with both hands, as if they were treasure. "Thank you, Mom. God bless you," the boy said, before walking away in search of other customers. Hope unwrapped one of the candies and put it in her mouth. The bittersweet taste of the tamarind made her close her eyes, instantly transporting her to her childhood, to when her grandmother used to prepare those same candies and give them to her as a reward when she was good or had helped with household chores. Her grandmother, Soledad, had been a wise and strong woman who had raised 7 children alone after her husband died in the Revolution. Hope remembered how her grandmother used to say, "My dear, life is like tamarind. It has its sweet and its bitter, and you have to accept both. You can't have one without the other." At that moment, in that dirty and noisy bus terminal, Hope understood the true meaning of those words for the first time. She had had the sweet, the joy of seeing Robert born, of seeing him grow up, of seeing him graduate from college with honors, of seeing him become a successful professional. But now it was time for the bitter, the betrayal, the abandonment, the humiliation, and her grandmother was right. She couldn't have one without the other. It was all part of the same life, the same path. The 3 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Hope saw families reunite, say goodbye, embrace. She saw mothers saying goodbye to their children with tears in their eyes, probably immigrants going north in search of a better life. She saw grandparents welcoming their grandchildren with open arms and smiles that lit up their wrinkled faces. Each scene was a reminder of what she didn't have, of the family she had thought she had. But that turned out to be an illusion. When her bus was finally announced, Hope stood up with difficulty, her joints protesting after sitting for so long. She boarded the bus slowly, clinging to the railing as she climbed the steep steps. She found her seat, one next to the window in the middle of the bus, and settled down, placing her purse on her lap as if it were a protective shield. Next to her sat a middle-aged woman, stout and with a kind face, carrying several shopping bags. "Good afternoon," she greeted with a smile. Hope returned the greeting, but she didn't have the energy for conversation. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the window, as the bus started with a roar of the engine and began its slow advance through the dense city traffic. The movement of the bus rocked her gently, and despite everything, the pain, the betrayal, the fear of the future, Hope felt her eyelids grow heavy. She hadn't slept the night before, too nervous about the trip and the meeting with Robert. And before that, she had spent weeks with her sleep interrupted by pain and worry. Her body was exhausted. Her mind was exhausted. Her heart was exhausted. She fell asleep as the bus left the city behind, and she dreamed. In her dream, she was young again. She was 25 years old and was in the field, on the land she and Tom had rented to grow corn. It was a beautiful morning, with the sun just rising on the horizon and painting the sky in impossible colors. Tom was by her side, strong and handsome as she remembered him before the years of hard work began to stoop him. And Robert was a baby in her arms, chubby and happy, laughing with that carefree laughter that only babies have. "Look, Hope," Tom said, pointing towards the field. "Our corn is growing strong. It's going to be a good harvest this year. Everything is going to be fine." And she believed him, because at that moment everything seemed possible. The future looked bright, and there was nothing in the world they couldn't face together. But then the dream changed, as dreams do, and suddenly Tom was gone. Robert was no longer a baby, but a grown man, and he was turning his back on her, walking towards a bright horizon that she couldn't reach, no matter how fast she ran. "Robert!" she yelled in the dream. She said, "Wait for me." But he didn't hear her, or didn't want to hear her, and continued to walk away until he became a small silhouette in the distance, until he disappeared completely. Hope woke up with a start, her heart racing, and a feeling of panic in her chest. For a moment she didn't know where she was, disoriented by the dream and the movement of the bus. Then reality returned, hitting her like a cold wave. She wasn't young. Tom had been dead for years, and Robert had abandoned her in the cruelest possible way. "Are you all right?" the woman sitting next to her asked, looking at her with concern. Hope nodded, swallowing the tears that threatened to overflow again. "Yes, thank you. It was just a bad dream." The woman gave her an understanding pat on the arm. "Long trips always bring strange dreams," she said wisely. "The movement of the bus confuses the brain." Hope looked out the window. They had already left the city behind, and they were on the highway, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun was already setting, staining everything with a melancholic golden hue. It was beautiful, in its own way, that landscape she knew so well, that land that had been her home all her life. "Are you headed back home?" the woman asked, and there was something in her tone that invited conversation without being intrusive. Hope nodded. "To Remedy Springs." "Ah, I know that town," the woman replied with a smile. "Small, but pretty. I'm from St. Louis, but my friend lives in Remedy Springs. Were you visiting family in the city?" The question, although asked innocently, was like a knife. Hope hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Technically, yes, she had gone to visit family, but at the same time she felt as if she no longer had family, as if she were a 73-year-old orphan. "I went to see my son," she finally said, "because the truth is always easier than a lie, even when it hurts. But it didn't turn out as I expected." The woman looked at her with those eyes that have seen much in life, that understand without needing long explanations. "Children," she said with a sigh, "sometimes they give us the greatest joys and the deepest sorrows." Hope felt that she had found someone who understood, at least a little. "Do you have children?" she asked. "3," the woman replied. "2 boys and 1 girl. The boys went north years ago to California looking for work. They send money when they can, but I haven't seen them in 3 years. My daughter lives in St. Louis with her family. I see her more often, but she's always busy. With her children, her job, her life. Sometimes it takes months for them to visit me." There was sadness in her voice, but also acceptance, as if she had made peace with this reality. "Doesn't it bother you?" Hope asked. "That they forget you?" The woman shrugged. "At first, yes. I was angry. I felt abandoned. But over time I understood something. I raised them to fly, not to stay tied to my apron strings. They flew, and they flew far. That hurts, but it also means I did my job well. I gave them wings." The words resonated with Hope, but at the same time she felt resistance. "But children should take care of their parents when they get old," she said with conviction. "It's their obligation, their duty." The woman looked at her with an expression that was half understanding, half skeptical. "Duty? Maybe. But duty without love is only obligation, and obligation creates resentment. I prefer my children to visit me because they want to, not because they feel obligated." Hope reflected on this in silence. Was that what she wanted from Robert? That he help her out of obligation, out of filial duty, even if he despised her in his heart? No. That wasn't what she wanted. She wanted him to love her, to value her, to be grateful for everything she had done for him. But love cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. It's either there or it isn't. My name is Guadalupe, but they call me Lupe, the woman said, extending her hand. Hope, she replied, shaking Lupe's plump and warm hand. And so, as the bus continued its journey through the falling night, the two women began to converse, sharing stories of their lives, their joys and sorrows, their hopes and disappointments. Lupe told her about her husband, who had died of a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving her widowed and alone. She told her about how she had learned to live with that loneliness, to find purpose in the small things, tending her garden, going to church, helping the neighbors with their problems. Life goes on, Lupe would say with a sad smile. You can get caught up in the past, crying over what you lost, or you can move forward, being grateful for what you had. Hope listened, absorbing these words like a dry sponge absorbs water. There was something comforting in Lupe's company, in her practical and unsentimental way of seeing life. She didn't offer empty words of comfort, nor did she try to minimize the pain. She simply acknowledged it as part of the human experience. And you? Lupe asked. What happened with your son? And then, perhaps because the darkness of the bus created a feeling of intimacy and anonymity, or perhaps because she simply needed to get it off her chest, Hope told her everything. She told her about Robert, how she had raised him alone after Tom died, about all the sacrifices she had made, how she had sold everything she owned to pay for his education. She told her about the illness, the operation she needed, how she had gone to ask her son for help. And she told her about what she had heard behind that door, about the laughter and the contempt, about how in that moment she had understood that to Robert she was no longer his mother, but an inconvenience, an embarrassment, an uncomfortable reminder of a past he wanted to forget. Lupe listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting understanding and compassion. When Hope finished, Lupe sighed deeply. "Oh, Mrs. Hope," she said with sadness, "what great pain you have carried today. But let me tell you something my mum told me when my oldest son went north and didn't come back for years. We cannot control what our children do with the lives we gave them. We can only control what we do with the life we have left." "But I invested my whole life in him," Hope protested, feeling the tears return. "How can I just accept that it was all in vain?" Lupe shook her head. "It wasn't in vain. You gave him life, you gave him education, you gave him opportunities. That he chooses not to value it. That is his loss, not yours. You fulfilled your part. You loved with all your heart. That is never in vain, even if you don't receive what you expected in return." Lupe's words were like balm on an open wound. They didn't heal it, not exactly, but they relieved the stinging. They made the pain a little more bearable. "And what do I do now?" Hope asked in a small voice. "How do I keep living when my only son sees me this way?" "You keep living for yourself," Lupe replied firmly. "You look for help with that operation. Call the number they gave you in the city. Fight for your life, not for him, but for yourself. Because you have worth. Because your life matters with or without your son's recognition." She paused. Then she added more softly, "And who knows, ma'am? Sometimes people change. Sometimes, when it's too late, they realize what they lost. Don't wait for that to happen. But don't completely close that door in your heart either." The rest of the trip passed more quickly with Lupe's company. They talked about lighter things, the soap operas they watched, the cooking recipes they knew, the gossip from their respective towns. This mundane conversation was comforting with a woman who had become a friend in the course of a few hours. Hope thought that this was what Robert would never understand. The richness that lay in simple human connections, in the kindness of strangers, in the solidarity of those who have suffered and therefore understand the suffering of others. When the bus finally arrived in Remedy Springs, it was past midnight. The town was dark and silent, with only a few lights twinkling here and there. Hope and Lupe said goodbye with a warm hug, exchanging addresses and promises to visit each other, promises they both knew they probably wouldn't keep, but which still felt important at that moment. "Take good care of yourself, Mrs. Hope," Lupe said as she got off the bus at her stop in St. Louis, shortly before reaching Remedy Springs. "And remember, your life has value." Hope nodded, not trusting her voice to reply. When the bus started again, she felt more alone than before, but also a little stronger. Lupe had given her something invaluable, the validation that her pain was real and justified, but also the perspective that it didn't have to define the rest of her life. When the bus stopped in Remedy Springs, Hope was the only person who got off. The town was wrapped in that particular darkness of small places, where there aren't enough streetlights and the stars shine more intensely than in the city. The air was cool and smelled of earth and the flowers from the church garden. It was the smell of her home, and despite everything that had happened that day, she felt some peace at being back. She walked slowly through the familiar streets, her feet finding the way almost by instinct in the darkness. She passed in front of Donnie's store, closed and with the metal curtains down. She passed in front of Mrs. Roberts's house, her lifelong neighbour, where a light was still shining in a window. She passed in front of the church, imposing and silent, with its bell that had marked all the important moments of her life: her baptism, her first communion, her wedding, Robert's baptism, Tom's funeral. She finally arrived at her house, a small plaster construction with a tiled roof, painted a faded yellow that had once been bright. The door creaked as it opened, that familiar sound that Robert had always promised to come back and fix, but never did because, deep down, that creak was comforting, a constant in a world that changed too quickly. She turned on the light, a solitary bulb hanging from the ceiling, illuminating the interior of her home. It was humble, no doubt. The walls were cracked and needed paint. The furniture was old, inherited from her parents and her parents' parents. The kitchen table wobbled a bit, and she had to put a wooden wedge under one leg to keep it stable. The cement floor was cold under her bare feet when she took off her sandals, but it was her home. Every object in that house had a story, a memory. The shawl hanging on the coat rack had belonged to her grandmother. The image of the Virgin Mary on the wall had been a wedding gift from her mother-in-law. The clay pot in the kitchen was where she had cooked countless meals for Robert when he was a child. Every crack in the walls, every stain on the floor, told a story of her life. Hope sank into the only comfortable chair in the house, a wooden rocking chair that Tom had made with his own hands shortly before he died. She rocked gently, the rhythmic movement calming her as it always had. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had heard Robert's words, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The pain was immense, like an ocean in which she could easily drown if she let it. But beneath the pain, something else began to emerge. A fierce determination, a refusal to surrender, a spark of the woman who had survived so many things in her life. She had lost her husband, but she had moved on. She had lost her house, but she had found somewhere to live. She had lost many things over the years, but she had never lost herself, and she wasn't going to start now. She stood up with effort and went to the small table where she kept her important documents in an old, rusted cookie tin. She took out the card Carol had given her in the park. She looked at it in the light of the bulb, reading the name of the health centre and the phone number. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would call and ask for help. Not for Robert, not to prove anything to anyone, but for herself. Because she still had life to live, and she wasn't going to waste it by dying for lack of money or out of pride. She prepared a cup of chamomile tea with the herbs she grew in her small backyard garden. She sat in the rocking chair with the hot cup in her hands, letting the steam warm her face, and began to remember, not with bitterness, but with a kind of bittersweet nostalgia, all the good times she had had with Robert before everything changed. She remembered how, when he was 5 years old, Robert had come running home with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked in the field, saying, "Look, Mom, they're for you 'cause you're the prettiest in the world." She remembered how he helped her with household chores, without her even asking, how he swept the yard while she washed clothes at the stone wash basin. She remembered his spontaneous hugs, his contagious laughter, the way he looked at her as if she were the most important person in the universe. Where had that child gone? Had he died gradually, replaced by the ambitious and cold adult? Or did he still exist somewhere deep inside Robert, buried under layers of success and pretense? Hope didn't know. Maybe she never would. But what she did know, with a clarity that cut through all the pain and confusion, was this. She had done the right thing. She had loved unconditionally. She had sacrificed willingly. She had given everything without expecting anything in return. The fact that Robert didn't value that love didn't make it any less real or less valuable. A mother's love doesn't depend on being reciprocated to be pure and true. With that thought, Hope finally allowed herself to cry again. But these tears were different. They were not the tears of humiliation and shock she had shed in the park. They were tears of grief, of letting go, of acceptance. She was crying for the son she had lost. Not to death, but to something perhaps worse. Indifference and selfishness. She was crying for all the dreams she had had for him. For them, dreams that would never come true. But also, in the midst of those tears, there was a small sprout of hope, because tomorrow the sun would rise, as it always did, and she would still be here, in her humble but loving home, in her small town full of good people. She would call the health centre, she would seek help for her operation, she would fight for her life, because her life mattered, even if her son didn't believe so. The morning came too soon, with the first rays of the sun filtering through the small window of her room, and the persistent crowing of Donnie's rooster that marked 6 in the morning as it had for the last 15 years. Hope had slept poorly, her sleep interrupted by nightmares and thoughts that spun endlessly in her head, like a stuck carousel. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the door to Robert's office, heard his mocking laughter, felt the knife of betrayal sinking deeper into her chest. She got up with difficulty, feeling every one of her 73 years in her protesting bones and creaking joints. The pain in her abdomen, that dull ache she had been ignoring for months until it became impossible to ignore, seemed more intense this morning. Or perhaps it was just that now she paid more attention to it, aware that time was running out faster than she had wanted to admit. She washed her face with cold water from the cistern, the icy water waking her up completely and making her shiver. There was no gas to heat water. That was a luxury she couldn't afford every day. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror hanging over the sink and barely recognized the woman looking back. When had she gotten so old? Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now seemed sunken and tired. Her skin, weathered by years of work under the sun, had more wrinkles than she remembered. Her hair, which was once black as coal, and which Tom said shone like silk under the moonlight, was now completely grey and was pulled back in a tight bun that made her look even more severe. But there was something new in her eyes this morning, something that hadn't been there before yesterday, a determination, a spark of rebellion, a refusal to simply give up and die in silence like a forgotten martyr. If Robert wouldn't help her, she would find another way. She had to. Not just for herself, but for all the mothers like her, who had given everything and received so little in return. Her story wouldn't end with her crying in a corner, waiting for death. She dressed in her cleanest clothes, a navy blue dress she had bought years ago at the St. Louis market that was still in good condition, and she carefully combed her hair, braiding her long hair and securing it with the hairpins that had belonged to her mother. If she was going to make that call, if she was going to ask for help, she would do it with dignity. Poverty was no excuse for neglect. That's what her mother had taught her, and it was a lesson she had never forgotten. The health centre card was on the kitchen table where she had left it the night before. She picked it up with hands that trembled slightly, more from nervousness than weakness. She didn't have a phone at home, another luxury she couldn't afford, but Mrs. Roberts, her neighbour, would allow her to use hers. Mrs. Roberts was one of the few people in town who had a landline phone, a vestige of better times when her husband was still alive and working in the city. Before leaving, Hope lit a candle in front of the image of the Virgin Mary and knelt on the cold cement floor, ignoring the protests of her arthritic knees. "Blessed Mother," she whispered with her eyes closed and her hands clasped. "I'm not asking you to change Robert. I'm not asking you to give me back what I lost. I only ask you for strength to face what's coming. And if it is your will that I be cured, help me find the way. But if not, give me peace to accept whatever awaits me." She prayed an Our Father and 3 Hail Marys, the prayers leaving her lips with the ease of decades of repetition. Then she crossed herself, stood up with effort, and left her house into the cool dawn of Remedy Springs. The town was beginning to wake up. Donnie had already opened his store and was sweeping the sidewalk in front of it, raising small clouds of dust that sparkled in the golden morning light. Mrs. Peters was walking towards the church with her rosary in hand, as she did every morning, for the 7 o'clock Mass. 2 children in school uniforms were running down the street, late for school, their backpacks bouncing on their small backs. "Good morning, Mrs. Hope," Donnie shouted when he saw her, raising his hand in a friendly salute. Hope returned the greeting with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Donnie had known her since she was a little girl. He had known her parents and her grandparents. He was part of the fabric of the town, one of those constant threads that kept everything together. Mrs. Roberts' house was only 3 houses away from hers. It was slightly larger and better maintained, with a front garden full of bougainvillea plants that climbed the walls and fell in cascades of fuchsia flowers. Mrs. Roberts was also a widow, but unlike Hope, her children visited her regularly and made sure she didn't lack anything. Hope knocked on the door gently, heard footsteps on the other side, then the door opened, revealing Mrs. Roberts, a stout woman in her 60s, with unnaturally black-dyed hair and a perpetual smile on her round face. "Hope, what a surprise! Come in, come in. Have you had breakfast yet? I have fresh coffee." "Good morning, Remedios." "Thank you, but I already ate," Hope lied, because in reality she hadn't eaten anything and her stomach was rumbling with hunger. But she didn't want to be a burden. "I came to ask you a favor. Can I use your phone? I need to make an important call." "Of course, dear. That's what friends are for. Come in. The phone is in the living room." Mrs. Roberts guided her inside her house, which smelled of coffee and sweet rolls. The living room was decorated with old but well-kept furniture, and the walls were covered with photographs of her children and grandchildren, a gallery of smiles and celebrations that reminded Hope of what she didn't have. The phone was an old rotary dial 1, anchored to the wall with a coiled cord. Hope took out the card with trembling hands and began to dial the number, her fingers clumsy with the dial she had to turn completely for each digit. Roberts, with the delicacy that comes from true friendship, withdrew to the kitchen to give her privacy, although Hope knew she could probably hear everything from there. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hope was about to hang up, thinking maybe it was too early, when a female voice answered. New Hope Community Health Center, good morning. The name of the center seemed like a sign, a wink from fate. Good morning, Hope replied, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. She cleared her throat and continued more strongly. I was given this number. I was told that you help people who need operations but don't have the money to pay for them. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Yes, ma'am. We have several medical assistance programs. Can you give me your name and tell me a little about your situation? The voice was kind, patient, without any trace of judgment or impatience. Hope told her everything: the diagnosis, the necessary operation, the impossible cost, her age, her financial situation. The woman on the other end of the phone listened attentively, asking questions occasionally, taking notes that sounded like typing on a computer. I understand, Mrs. Hope, she finally said. What you need is definitely something we can help with. We have a special program for low-income seniors who need surgery. Can you come to our offices for an evaluation? We are in St. Louis, in the industrial district. St. Louis. It was more than an hour away by bus, and the round-trip fare would cost her money she barely had. But she had no choice. Yes, she replied with determination. When can I come? How about Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning? We'll give you an appointment with our social worker and one of our doctors to review your case. Hope looked at the calendar hanging on Mrs. Roberts's wall. It was Friday. Monday was in 3 days. 3 days of waiting, of uncertainty, of hope mixed with fear. But it was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that was more than she had had the day before. I'll be there, she promised. Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to me. It's our job, Ma'am. That's what we're here for. Bring all the medical documentation you have, your ID, and any proof of income if you have it. Don't worry if you don't have everything. We will work with what you have. We'll see you on Monday. The call ended, and Hope stood there, holding the phone receiver against her chest, feeling that for the first time in days she could breathe completely. Mrs. Roberts appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 steaming cups of coffee and an inquiring expression on her face. Good news? She asked Hope. Hope nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Roberts handed her one of the cups and sat on the sofa, patting the cushion next to her in an invitation for Hope to sit down. Tell me, Mrs. Roberts said with that direct way that small-town women have, who have lived long enough to know that circumlocution and pretense are a waste of time. And then, as they drank coffee and shared the sweet roll that Mrs. Roberts insisted she eat, Hope told her everything. Not only about the call to the health center, but also about her trip to Chicago, about Robert, about what she had heard behind that door. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she spoke, but this time she didn't hide them. Mrs. Roberts listened in silence, her expression changing from surprise to indignation to deep sadness. When Hope finished, Mrs. Roberts hugged her tightly. A hug from a sister, a friend, from someone who understands that sometimes words are not enough. That ungrateful boy, Mrs. Roberts muttered, her voice trembling with anger. After everything you did for him, he should be ashamed to call himself your son. But then, softening her tone, she added, But don't worry, Hope. God sees everything, and life has ways of teaching lessons to those who need to learn them. For now, focus on yourself, on getting well, on living. They sat together for a long time, Two widows who had survived losses and disappointments, who had stood tall when the world tried to knock them down, who found comfort in the silent company of someone who truly understood. They didn't need to fill the silence with empty words. Sometimes, presence was enough. When Hope finally stood up to leave, Mrs. Roberts stopped her. "Wait," she said, disappearing into her bedroom. She returned a moment later with an envelope. "It's only $500, she said, pressing the envelope into Hope's hands, despite her protests. "For the fair on Monday, and for you to eat something in St. Louis. Don't argue with me. What are friends but sisters we choose?" Hope wanted to refuse it, her pride screaming that she didn't need charity, that she could manage on her own as she always had. But then she looked into Mrs. Roberts's eyes and saw not pity, but genuine love. The generosity of someone who gave because they could and because they wanted to, not out of obligation or to make the recipient feel small. And Hope understood that sometimes accepting help was also an act of humility and grace. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging her friend again. "I'll pay you back when I can." "No hurry," Mrs. Roberts replied, waving her hand as if swatting a fly. "And if you can't, it doesn't matter. Money comes and goes, but true friends are forever." Hope left Mrs. Roberts' house feeling lighter than she had felt in days. It still hurt. The wound of Robert's betrayal was still fresh and bleeding, but there was hope now, and she had remembered something she had forgotten in the midst of her pain. She wasn't completely alone. She had a town full of people who knew her, who valued her, who would be there for her in ways her own son wouldn't. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Hope kept busy, cleaning her house from top to bottom, organizing her medical documents, preparing for the Monday appointment. But every time she stopped, every time her mind wasn't occupied with tasks, thoughts of Robert returned like crows to a newly ploughed field. She wondered if he had received the flowers and the letter. She wondered if he had read them, or if he had simply thrown them away without a second thought. She wondered if he had felt even a hint of remorse, of guilt, of recognition that he had deeply hurt the woman who had given him life. But she didn't know the answers to those questions, and maybe she never would, and perhaps that was better. Sometimes ignorance was easier to bear than the certainty of unlove. On Sunday night, Hope could barely sleep. She was nervous about the appointment the next day, worried that something would go wrong, that they would tell her they couldn't help her after all, that this little spark of hope would be extinguished, leaving her in a darkness even deeper than before. She prayed for hours, her lips moving in silent prayers, while the stars slowly turned in the sky outside her window. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of Tom. In her dream, they were sitting in the field as they used to in their early years of marriage, when they still had big dreams and the future seemed bright. Tom held her in his arms, his chin resting on her head, and told her, "Don't give up, my love. You are stronger than you think. You always have been." She woke up with tears on her cheeks, but a feeling of peace in her heart. Tom had been a good man, a man who had loved and respected her until his last breath, and although she would have wanted him to be there to face this with her, his memory was enough. He had loved her in a way Robert would never understand, and that love, even if no longer physically present, still held her up. Monday dawned cool and clear, a perfect day for new beginnings. Hope dressed carefully in her best clothes, the same navy blue dress she had worn to make the phone call. She meticulously combed her hair, braiding it and wrapping it in an elegant bun. She put on the silver earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, small circles that shone softly against her weathered skin. Before leaving, she stood in front of the mirror one last time. The woman looking back was old, yes, and tired, but there was dignity in her posture, determination in her eyes. She was a woman who had survived 73 years of life in this cruel world, a woman who had known both the purest love and the most painful betrayal. And she was still standing. The bus to St. Louis left at 7 in the morning from the town centre. Hope arrived 15 minutes early, sitting on the metal bench under the big tree in front of the pharmacy. Other passengers began to arrive, women with shopping bags, workers with their lunch boxes, students with heavy backpacks. The normal rhythm of life continued, indifferent to the personal dramas of each individual. When the bus arrived, an old and worn but reliable vehicle, Hope boarded and paid her fare with part of the money Mrs. Roberts had given her. She found a seat near the window and settled in for the hour-long trip, watching her town get smaller in the distance until it disappeared completely. The landscape passed slowly, fields of corn stretching to the horizon, ranches with cows grazing lazily, small towns, similar to hers, with their white churches and central squares. It was the America she knew and loved, the America of hard-working, humble people, the America that Robert had decided was no longer good enough for him. When the bus finally arrived in St. Louis, Hope had to ask for directions several times before finding the New Hope Community Health Center. It was in a modest part of the city, in a 2-story building that had been painted a cheerful green. A sign over the entrance proclaimed in large letters, "Where Hope Meets Healing." Hope climbed the steps slowly, her heart beating quickly in her chest, part nervousness and part hope. She pushed the glass door and entered a waiting room full of people, mothers with young children, seniors like her, young and old people, all clearly of limited means, but all treated with dignity by the staff. She approached the reception counter, where a young woman with her hair pulled back in a high ponytail and a genuine smile greeted her. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I have an appointment at 10, Hope replied. "I'm Hope Stevens." The receptionist checked her computer and nodded. "Yes, here it is. Please have a seat. The social worker will be with you in a few minutes." Hope found a seat between a pregnant woman who looked barely older than a teenager and an old man dozing with his hat over his eyes. 20 minutes later, a middle-aged woman with short hair and glasses appeared in the waiting room. "Mrs. Hope Stevens?" Hope stood up, her legs trembling slightly. "That's me." "Nice to meet you, ma'am. I'm Patricia Flores, social worker. Please, come in." Hope followed Ms. Flores through a narrow hallway to a small office with walls decorated with anatomy posters and signs about disease prevention. Ms. Flores indicated that she should sit in a chair across from her desk and then sat down herself, opening a new folder and picking up a pen. "Well, Mrs. Hope," she began with a warm smile, "tell me your story." Hope took a deep breath and began to speak. She told Ms. Flores about the pain she had been ignoring for months, about how she had finally gone to the public hospital, where, after weeks of waiting for tests, she had been diagnosed with a tumor in her uterus that needed to be removed urgently. She explained that the doctors had given her 2 options: operate in the next few months or face consequences that could be fatal. She showed her all the papers she had brought, medical studies with terms she barely understood, but that she knew were serious. Ms. Flores listened attentively, taking notes and asking specific questions about her financial situation, her family, her income. When Hope reached the part about Robert, she hesitated. She didn't want to talk about him. She didn't want to relive that humiliation in front of a stranger. But Ms. Flores had asked directly, "Do you have family who can help you financially?" "I have a son," Hope replied slowly, each word weighing like a stone on her tongue. "But he has his own life. He is not in a position to help." It was a lie, but a lie easier to tell than the truth, that her son simply didn't want to help her, that he saw her as an embarrassment and a burden. Ms. Flores looked at her for a long moment, and Hope had the feeling that this woman, who had probably heard many stories from desperate people, knew there was more to that answer than was being said. But she didn't press. She simply nodded and continued with her questions. After 45 minutes of interviewing, Ms. Flores closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Hope," she said seriously, but also warmly, "I want to be honest with you. The operation you need is expensive, even with our discounts and assistance programs, but we have a special fund for cases like yours, older women of low income who need urgent surgeries. I'm going to submit your case to the review committee, but I can tell you right now that I believe you qualify for significant help." Hope felt something loosen in her chest, as if she had been holding her breath for days and could finally exhale. "Really, sir?" she asked with a trembling voice. "You can help me?" "Yes, ma'am. I can't promise that we will cover 100% of the cost, but we will cover the majority. You would probably have to pay between $3,000 and $5,000, depending on what the committee decides. Do you think you could get that amount?" $3,000 to $5,000. It was still a lot of money for someone like Hope, but it was infinitely more manageable than the more than $100,000 she had been quoted at the public hospital. "Yes," she replied with determination. "I can get it. I'll sell whatever I have to sell, but I'll get it." Miss Flores smiled. "I'm glad to hear that determination, ma'am. Now I'm going to send you to Dr. Rodriguez so he can examine you and we can confirm the diagnosis and treatment plan. Afterwards, you will come back to me to finish the paperwork." She stood up and Hope followed her, feeling for the first time in weeks that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Dr. Rodriguez was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and gentle hands. He examined her carefully, reviewed all her previous studies, and asked her more questions about her symptoms. Unlike the doctors at the public hospital, who had treated her like just another number in an endless line of patients, Dr. Rodriguez took his time, explained everything in terms she could understand, and treated her with a respect that reminded her she was still a person, not just a medical case. "Mrs. Hope," he finally said, "your situation is serious, but not desperate. The tumor you have needs to be removed soon. That's true, but if we do it in the next 6 to 8 weeks, the prognosis is excellent. With a successful operation and proper care, you can live many more years." He paused. Then he added with a smile, "And who knows, maybe long enough to see that son of yours realize how lucky he is to have you." Hope blinked in surprise. How had he known? But then she saw the understanding in the doctor's eyes and understood that he, like Ms. Flores, had seen enough cases to read between the lines, to understand the untold stories behind the carefully chosen words of his patients. When she finished with Dr. Rodriguez, she returned to Ms. Flores to complete the paperwork. She signed forms, provided information, listened to explanations about the process. The committee would meet in 3 days to review her case. If everything went well, she would receive a call with the decision and they could schedule the surgery for within a month. A month. In a month, this could be resolved. In a month, she could have a second chance at life. The thought was almost too big to fully process. By the time she left the health center, it was past noon. The sun was shining brightly in the cloudless sky, and Hope's stomach was rumbling, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything since the small portion of beans she had for breakfast at 5 in the morning. With the money Mrs. Roberts had given her, she decided to treat herself to a small luxury. She hadn't eaten at a restaurant, even a humble one, in years. She found a small diner near the health center, the kind of place that serves homemade food at reasonable prices. She sat at a plastic table under a faded umbrella and ordered a plate of turkey and mashed potatoes with gravy. When the food arrived, steaming and aromatic, Hope had to blink back tears. It was a simple dish, the kind of food she had cooked thousands of times in her life. But at that moment, it tasted of hope, of possibility, of life. As she ate slowly, savoring every bite, a family arrived and sat at the table next to hers. They were 3 generations, a grandmother, a young mother, and 2 small children. The children were noisy and playful, laughing and fighting over who would get the last piece of bread. The grandmother gently scolded them, but her eyes shone with love. The young mother served food to her mother before serving herself, a gesture of respect that was so natural she probably didn't even think about it. Hope watched them, feeling a complex mixture of joy for them and pain for what she didn't have. That was the family she had dreamed of having someday, generations united, taking care of each other, sharing meals and laughter and love. But fate had other plans for her. Or maybe it wasn't fate. Perhaps it was simply that she had raised her son in a world that valued different things, that had taught him that individual success was more important than family connections. But had it really been the world's fault? Or had she herself contributed to creating the man Robert had become? She wondered if by protecting him so much from difficulties, by giving him everything she never had, she had inadvertently taught him that things came easily, that the sacrifices of others had no value, because he had never had to sacrifice anything. The question haunted her, with no easy answers. She finished her meal and paid at the counter. The owner of the diner, a stout woman with an apron stained with sauce, smiled warmly. "Have a good day, ma'am. Come back soon." Hope nodded, knowing she probably never would. St. Louis was too far from Remedy Springs for casual visits, but she appreciated the sentiment nonetheless. The bus back to her town wouldn't leave until 4 in the afternoon, so she had plenty of time. She decided to walk through downtown St. Louis, something she hadn't done in years. The city had grown and changed since the last time she was there. There were new stores, modern buildings, shiny shopping malls, but there were also things that remained the same. The imposing cathedral in the center, the traditional market with its fruit and vegetable stalls, the cobblestone streets of the historic district. As she walked aimlessly, Hope found herself in front of an elegant jewelry store. In the window were diamond rings, gold necklaces, expensive watches, and there, among all those costly things, she saw a pair of simple silver earrings with small blue stones. They were beautiful in their simplicity, and they reminded her of the earrings she had sold years ago to pay for Robert's tuition. She entered the store almost without thinking, pushed by an impulse she didn't fully understand. A young salesperson approached her with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He probably thought she couldn't afford to buy anything in a store like that. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "Those earrings in the window," Hope said, pointing to them. "The silver ones with the blue stones. How much are they?" The salesman checked the tag. $850, ma'am. It was a lot of money, money she should be saving for her share of the operation. But something in Hope rebelled against the idea of continuing to deny herself everything, of continuing to put the needs and desires of others before her own. She had lived 73 years sacrificing, denying herself small and large things. For once, she wanted something just for herself. "I'll take them," she said firmly. The salesman seemed surprised, but pleased. He carefully wrapped the earrings in a small box with a ribbon, and Hope paid with part of the money she had left, feeling a mixture of guilt and liberation. When she left the store with her small package, she felt different, as if by buying something nice for herself, something that was not necessary but simply desired, she had made a statement. Her life mattered. Her desires mattered. She mattered, not just as a mother or a worker or any other role she had played, but as Hope. as an individual person with a right to nice things. She found a bench in a small square and sat down, opening the little box and admiring the earrings. The sunlight made the blue stones sparkle, and Hope felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: pure, simple joy, uncomplicated by obligations, check-ins, or worries. She carefully took off her grandmother's earrings, putting them in her purse, and put on the new ones. She didn't have a mirror to see herself, but it didn't matter. She felt them on her ears, a small weight that reminded her that she had made a decision just for herself. Time passed more quickly than she expected. When she looked at her watch, it was almost 3:30. She had to hurry to get to the bus terminal. She stood up, her legs protesting after all the walking of the day, and headed towards the station. The return bus was less crowded than the one in the morning. Hope found a seat next to the window and settled in for the ride. She was tired, physically and emotionally exhausted by the day, but it was a different kind of tiredness than what she had felt after her trip to Chicago. It was not the exhaustion of defeat, but the satisfied tiredness of having done something productive, of having taken steps forward. As the bus left St. Louis behind and entered the familiar landscape of fields and small towns, Hope closed her eyes and let her mind wander. She thought about everything that had happened in the past few weeks: the terrifying diagnosis, the decision to ask Robert for help, the devastating betrayal, the encounter with Carol in the park, the kindness of Mrs. Roberts, and now the real hope of getting the operation she needed. It was curious how life worked. She had gone to Chicago seeking salvation in her son and had found only rejection. But in that rejection, in that pain, she had discovered something more valuable: her own strength. She had discovered that she didn't need Robert to survive, that there was life and kindness and possibility beyond what he could or couldn't give her. It didn't mean the pain had disappeared. The wound was still there, deep and bleeding, and probably would never heal completely. There would always be a scar, a sensitive spot in her heart where the unconditional love for her son had once been. But she was learning that she could live with that pain, that it didn't have to define or destroy her. The bus made a stop in a small town before reaching Remedy Springs. An old man boarded with his back bent from years of work in the field, and hands so calloused and cracked they looked like leather. He sat in the seat across from Hope, letting out a sigh of relief, as if every second he wasn't working was a precious gift. Hope watched him from her seat, seeing in him a reflection of an entire generation of Americans who had worked until they broke to give their children better lives. She wondered if he too had children who had forgotten him, who considered his farming past shameful. Or perhaps he was one of the lucky ones, with children who still valued and cared for him. As if he felt her gaze, the man turned and smiled at her, a smile with missing teeth but full of warmth. "Good afternoon, ma'am." "Good afternoon," Hope replied, returning the smile. They didn't exchange any more words, but there was an understanding between them, the silent recognition of two people who had lived similar lives, who had known hard work and sacrifice and the dignity that came from both. When the bus finally arrived in Remedy Springs, the sun was setting, painting the sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple. Hope got off the bus slowly, her legs even stiffer after the trip. The town greeted her with its familiar sounds: the barking of dogs, the crowing of roosters preparing for the night, the voices of mothers calling their children for dinner. She walked towards her house, greeting the neighbors she met along the way. Donnie was closing his store and waved to her. "How was St. Louis, Mrs. Hope?" "Good, Donnie, very good." And it was true. It had gone well, better than she had dared to hope. When she arrived at her house and opened the door with her rusted key, she was greeted by the familiar silence of her home. There was no one waiting for her, no joyful voices welcoming her, no hot food on the stove. But for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel like loneliness, but like peace. She turned on the light, put her purse on the table, and went straight to the bathroom mirror. She looked at herself, admiring the new earrings that shone softly against her skin, and smiled, a real and genuine smile that reached her eyes. She was not the woman she had been before traveling to Chicago. That woman had died in that elegant hallway, listening to her son's cruel laughter. But in her place, someone new had been born, a woman who was still standing despite everything, a woman who had decided to fight for her own life, a woman who was learning, slowly and painfully, to value herself. That night, as she prepared a simple dinner of quesadillas and beans, Hope thought about the future. If the committee approved her case, she would have the operation. She would have to find a way to get the $3,000 to $5,000 she would need to pay. Maybe she could sell some of the old furniture in the house, or maybe she could borrow from Mrs. Roberts and pay her back little by little. One way or another, she would get it. And after the operation, if all went well, she would have years more of life. What would she do with those years? She didn't know yet, but she knew she would no longer spend them waiting for Robert to return, waiting for him to become the son she had dreamed of. That wait was a path to bitterness and resentment, and she refused to let her son's abandonment poison her from within. Maybe she would travel a little, see places she had never seen. Maybe she would get more involved in the church or in helping other older women in the town who were alone. Maybe she would simply spend her days tending her small garden, reading books from the traveling library that came to town once a month, enjoying the simple things she had taken for granted for so long. Whatever she decided to do, she would do it for herself. That was the most important lesson she had learned from this whole experience, that her value didn't depend on being needed or valued by others, especially by Robert. Her value was intrinsic, inherent to her existence as a human being who had lived, loved, suffered, and survived. After dinner, Hope took out paper and a pen. There was something she needed to do, something she had been avoiding because it hurt too much. But now, with some distance from the initial shock of the betrayal, she felt she was ready. She began to write a letter, not to Robert. She had already written everything she needed to tell him, but to herself. A letter that would be like a journal, documenting her thoughts and feelings at this crucial moment in her life. She wrote about the pain and the betrayal, but also about hope and resilience. She wrote about what she had learned and how she was changing. She wrote until her hand ached and the candle she had lit to save electricity had burned down to almost nothing. When she finally put down the pen and read what she had written, she saw reflected in those words the story of a woman who refused to be a victim, who chose to rise up even when the world pushed her down, who found hope in the most unexpected places. And she felt proud of that woman. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud of herself. The 3 days of waiting for the committee's response felt like 3 years. Every time she heard footsteps approaching her house, Hope's heart jumped, thinking maybe it was someone with news. Every time she went to Mrs. Roberts' house to ask if she had received any calls, her friend shook her head, looking at her with compassion. Hope tried to keep busy so as not to go crazy with anxiety. She cleaned her house until every corner shone. She fixed the small garden in her backyard, pulling out weeds and pruning the plants she had neglected for weeks. She mended old clothes that had been piling up in a basket. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind away from the dark thoughts that threatened to consume her. In the evenings, when the silence became too heavy, she would take out the letter she had written to herself and reread it, reminding herself who she was choosing to be. A fighter, a survivor, a woman who wouldn't give up without a fight. On the 4th day, a Thursday morning, Hope was at Mrs. Roberts' house drinking coffee when the phone rang. Both women looked at each other, and Hope felt her heart stop for a moment. Mrs. Roberts answered with her usual cheerfulness, but her expression changed when she heard who was on the other end. "Yes, she's here. One moment, please." She extended the phone to Hope, with a smile that tried to be encouraging but couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. Hope took the receiver with hands that trembled so much she could barely hold it. "Hello, Mrs. Hope Stevens." It was Ms. Flores. "Yes, that's me." "Mrs. Hope, I have good news. The committee has reviewed your case and has approved your request for assistance. We are going to cover 90% of the cost of your operation. You will only have to pay $3,000, and we can schedule the surgery for within 3 weeks." Hope had to sit down because her legs could no longer support her. $3,000. She could get $3,000, and within 3 weeks, she would have the operation she needed. She would live. She would have a second chance. "Mrs. Hope, are you there?" Yes, I'm here," she managed to say in a choked voice. "I... Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me. Thank you." "It's our job, Mom. We want you to come in next Monday for some pre-operative tests and to meet the surgeon who will be performing your operation. Can you come?" "Yes, I'll be there at whatever time is necessary." "Perfect. We'll see you at 9 in the morning. And Mrs. Hope..." "Yes." "Congratulations. You're going to be fine." When she hung up the phone, Hope turned to Mrs. Roberts, and the two women embraced, crying tears of joy and relief. "You did it," Mrs. Roberts whispered, stroking her friend's hair. "You did it, Hope. You're going to be fine." And for the first time in months, Hope believed it. She was going to be fine. Not because of Robert, not despite Robert, but because she had decided to fight for herself, because she had found help in unexpected places, because she had discovered that she was worth saving. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Hope sold some old furniture she no longer used, and with that she collected $2,000. Mrs. Roberts insisted on lending her the other $1,000, refusing to take no for an answer. "I already told you that money comes and goes," she had said firmly, "but friends are forever, and I know you'll pay me back when you can." On Monday, she went to the health center for her pre-operative tests. She met Dr. Pert Hernandez, the surgeon who would perform her operation, a man in his 60s with completely white hair and a calm voice that conveyed confidence. He explained the procedure in detail, the risks and benefits, and assured her that he had done hundreds of these surgeries with excellent results. "You have a strong spirit, Mrs. Hope," he had told her while examining her. "That is almost as important as the surgery itself. I've seen young patients give up because they don't have the will to fight, and I've seen older patients survive against all odds because they refuse to give up. You are one of the fighters. I see it in your eyes." His words filled her with renewed determination. He was right. She was a fighter. She always had been. She had fought against poverty, against circumstances, against loss, and now she would fight against this disease and win. During those days of preparation, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while Hope was at home organizing her things, because she would have to stay in St. Louis for a week after the surgery for recovery and follow-up, she heard someone knocking at her door. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with Father Michael, the town priest. "Good afternoon, Hope," the priest greeted her with a kind smile. He was a man in his 40s who had arrived in the town 5 years ago and had won everyone's affection for his genuine concern for his parishioners. "Father, please come in. To what do I owe the honor of your visit?" Father Michael entered and sat in the chair Hope offered him. "I heard about your situation from Mrs. Roberts," he said directly, "about your illness and the operation you need. I wanted to come and offer you the support of the church." Hope felt her eyes fill with tears. "That's very kind, Father, but I already have the money I need for the operation." "I'm not just talking about money," Father Michael clarified, "although if you needed it, the community would be willing to help. I'm talking about spiritual support, prayers, knowing that you are not alone in this." He paused. Then he added more softly, "I also heard about your son, about Robert." Hope tensed. She hadn't told anyone but Mrs. Roberts about what had happened with Robert, but in a small town, secrets were almost impossible to keep. "I don't want to talk about that, Father," she said in a strained voice. "I understand," the priest replied with compassion, "but I want you to know something, Hope. The pain you feel, the betrayal, the disappointment, are valid and real feelings. God doesn't ask you to deny them or pretend they don't exist, but He also doesn't want them to consume you. Forgiveness is not for Robert. Forgiveness is for you, to free yourself from the poison of resentment that can destroy you from within." "I'm not ready to forgive," Hope admitted with a broken voice. "I don't know if I ever will be." "And that's okay," Father Michael replied. "Forgiveness is a process, not an event. It can take days, months, years, or it may never fully come. But in the meantime, you can choose not to let this define you. You can choose to keep living, to keep being the extraordinary woman that you are." Those words stayed with Hope long after Father Michael left. He was right. Forgiveness was complicated, perhaps impossible for now, but she didn't have to forgive to keep living. She didn't have to completely let go of the pain to find joy in other things. Both things could coexist, the pain for what she lost and the hope for what she could still have. 2 days before the surgery, while Hope was packing a small suitcase with the few things she would need for her stay in St. Louis, she heard a car stop in front of her house. It wasn't common to hear cars on her street. Most people in town walked or used bicycles. Curious, she peered out the window and her heart stopped. It was Robert's car, that shiny, ostentatious vehicle that looked so out of place on the dusty streets of Remedy Springs. And getting out of the car, in a suit and tie despite the heat, was her son. For a moment, Hope didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to run to the door, throw it wide open, hug him, and forget everything that had happened. But another part, the part that had grown and changed in recent weeks, remained still, observing. Robert walked to her door with uncertain steps, so different from the arrogant confidence he usually showed. He knocked softly, almost timidly. Hope waited a moment, breathing deeply, bracing herself, and then opened the door. Mother and son looked at each other for a long moment in silence. Hope saw that Robert had dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept well in days. His suit, although expensive, was slightly wrinkled, and his hair wasn't as perfectly combed as always. He looked human, vulnerable, like the child he once was, before success and ambition transformed him. "Mum?" he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Hope didn't answer. She simply looked at him, waiting. Can I come in?" Hope took a step back, allowing him to enter. Robert crossed the threshold and looked around the humble house where he had grown up, the house he probably hadn't truly visited, not just physically, but with his heart and mind, in years. He saw the cracked walls, the old furniture, the dignified poverty in every corner, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see it. They stood in the small living room, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Robert spoke. "I got your flowers, and your letter." Hope nodded, but said nothing. "I didn't know you had come that day," My secretary told me an elderly lady had come asking for me, but she didn't tell me it was you. And I was in an important meeting and I listened, Hope interrupted in a quiet but firm voice. I heard everything you said about me, Robert. I heard you laughing with your friends. I heard you call me dramatic, how you saw me as a burden. Robert closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. Mum, No, Hope said, raising a hand. Let me speak first. For days I've wondered what I would say to you if I ever saw you again. I've imagined this conversation hundreds of times, and what I have to say is this. I forgive you for being human, for being imperfect, for failing. But I cannot forgive you for denying everything I gave up for you. I cannot forgive you for being ashamed of me, of your roots, of the life that gave you birth. Robert now had tears running down his cheeks, tears Hope hadn't seen in him since he was a little boy. I'm not ashamed of you, Mum. I'm ashamed of myself. When I read your letter, when I saw those flowers withering on my desk, something broke inside me. I remembered who I used to be. I remembered all your sacrifices, and I realized that I had become exactly the kind of person I used to despise. He sat heavily in the old rocking chair Tom had made and covered his face with his hands. I was so obsessed with success, with proving to the world that I had made it, that I forgot where I came from. I forgot that the only thing that really matters is family, is love, is loyalty. I became a stranger to myself. Hope listened to him, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. She had waited for this moment. She had dreamed of hearing these words. But now that they were here, she discovered that she didn't feel the joy she had imagined. She felt something more complicated, a mixture of relief, sadness, and a kind of detachment, as if she were watching the scene from the outside. What do you want, Robert? She finally asked. Forgiveness. Absolution. For me to act like nothing happened. Robert looked up, his eyes red and swollen. I don't expect anything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I regret every cruel word, every moment of indifference, and I needed to tell you that I came to help with your operation. Mrs. Roberts called me. She told me everything. I want to pay the $3,000 you need, and I want to make sure you have the best care possible. For a moment, Hope was tempted. $3,000 was a lot of money for her, and the idea of not having to worry about it was attractive. But then she remembered something Ms. Flores had told her. Forgiveness is for you, not for him. And she realized that if she accepted Robert's money now, if she let him fix things with money, she would be allowing him to escape the true consequences of his actions. She would be allowing him to buy his way back in without truly doing the necessary internal work to change. No, she finally said. Robert looked at her in surprise. No, I don't need your money, Robert. I already have the money I need. What I need from you, if you are going to be in my life again, cannot be bought with money. I need respect. I need you to truly value who I am and where I come from. I need you to show up, not just when it's convenient or when you feel guilty, but consistently. I need a son, not an ATM. Robert nodded slowly, processing her words. You're right, and I understand if you don't want me in your life. I understand if the damage I did is irreparable. But if you give me another chance, I promise to be better, not just by promising with words, but by showing it with actions. Hope looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, looking for sincerity, and she found it, mixed with shame, regret, and pain. But it was there. Her son had returned, not the son she had dreamed of, but a real son, imperfect, but genuinely remorseful. I can't promise you that things will go back to how they were, Hope said slowly, because before wasn't as wonderful as I thought. Before, I put you on a pedestal and put myself beneath you, and that wasn't healthy for either of us. If we are going to rebuild our relationship, it has to be on different terms. It has to be between two adults who respect each other mutually, not between a mother who sacrifices herself until she disappears and a son who takes everything without gratitude. I understand, Robert replied, and I accept those terms. Can I Can I at least take you to St. Louis for your surgery? Can I be there during your recovery? Hope hesitated. It was tempting to say yes immediately, to fall back into the familiar pattern of accepting whatever Robert offered, but she stopped, taking a moment to truly think about what she wanted. You can take me, she finally said, and you can visit me during my recovery, but I'm also going to have Mrs. Roberts there, because she has been my family when you weren't. And I need you to understand and respect that. I need you to understand that I built a life without you, that I found support in other places, and that those people are now important to me. I understand, Robert said, and he seemed sincere. And I'd like to meet Mrs. Roberts properly, to thank her for being there when I wasn't. He stood up, looking at his mother with a mixture of hope and fear. Mum, I know I can't undo the past, but I can try to make the future different. Will you give me that chance? Hope thought about everything that had happened, everything she had learned. She thought about the woman she had been, willing to sacrifice everything, even her dignity, and the woman she had become. She thought about forgiveness and what it truly meant, and she realized that forgiving didn't mean forgetting or pretending that nothing had happened. It meant choosing to let go of the poison of resentment while maintaining the wisdom gained through pain. Yes, she finally said, I will give you that chance. But Robert, understand this. If you fail me this way again, if I become a disgrace to you again, there won't be another chance. I will not sacrifice myself again, trying to earn the love of someone who should give it to me freely. I have a life to live, and whether it's with you or without you, I will live it with dignity. Robert nodded, more tears running down his face. He took a hesitant step towards her, and Hope opened her arms. They hugged, but it was different from the hugs of the past. It was not the embrace of a desperate mother clinging to her son, nor the awkward embrace of a son fulfilling an obligation. It was the embrace of two people who had hurt, and been hurt, who were choosing to try and rebuild something that had been broken, knowing that it would never be exactly the same, but hoping that it could be something real. When they separated, Robert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. My car is outside. Do you want us to go to St. Louis now so you can familiarize yourself with the hospital where the surgery will be? Hope shook her head. I've already been there. I already know the team. What I need now is mental and spiritual preparation. But you can come back the day after tomorrow morning to take me. The surgery is the day after that. Robert nodded. I'll be there. Early. And Robert, Hope added, her voice softer now. Thank you for coming. I know it must have been difficult, but it meant a lot that you did. A small smile appeared on Robert's face, the first genuine smile Hope had seen on him in years. I should have come a long time ago. But better late than never, right? That's what we hope, Hope replied. She walked with him to the door, watching him get into his shiny car that looked so out of place on her humble street. When he started the engine and waved goodbye, Hope returned the gesture, watching him drive away until the car disappeared in a cloud of dust at the end of the street. She stood at her door for a long time after he left, processing what had just happened. She had waited for this moment in so many different ways in her imagination. Sometimes, she had imagined it would never come. that Robert would remain lost to her forever. Other times, she had imagined a perfect, melodramatic reunion where everything was instantly fixed. Reality, as always, was more complicated than any fantasy. She didn't know if the reconciliation with Robert would last. She didn't know if he would really change, or if this was just a temporary moment of guilt that would fade once his conscience was clear. But what she did know was that she had changed. She was no longer the desperate woman who had traveled to Chicago weeks ago, willing to accept any crumb of attention or affection from her son. She was someone different now, stronger, more aware of her own worth, more willing to set boundaries. The night before her surgery, Hope couldn't sleep. It wasn't because of fear of the operation, although there was certainly nervousness. It was more a feeling of being on the verge of something new, of a second chance at life that she had never expected to have. She got out of bed at 3 in the morning and went out to her small backyard, wrapped in a shawl against the night cold. The sky was incredibly clear, filled with more stars than she had seen in a long time. The moon was barely a thin crescent, allowing the stars to shine with all their intensity. Hope sat on the step of her back door, looking up, feeling small, but connected to something larger. She whispered to the sky, talking to her dead husband as she sometimes did in moments of loneliness or confusion. I wish you were here to see this, to see how our story continues, even after so many endings. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know if Robert is really going to change. I don't know if the operation is going to go well. But for the first time in a long time, I have hope, and I think that's enough for now. The wind blew softly, moving the leaves of the avocado tree in her garden, and Hope chose to believe it was Tom answering, telling her that everything would be fine, that she had been strong and brave, and that she deserved this second chance. When the sun finally began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Hope went back inside. She showered carefully, put on her cleanest navy blue dress, and put on the new earrings she had bought in St. Louis, those silver earrings with blue stones that represented her decision to value herself. She was ready. Robert arrived exactly at the time he had promised, driving carefully through the uneven streets of the town. This time, Vanessa wasn't with him, and when Hope asked about her, Robert simply said, I told her everything that happened. She's ashamed, too. She wants to meet you properly someday, when the time is right. The trip to St. Louis was calm, but not uncomfortable. They talked about small things, the weather, the town, the changes in the city. They didn't delve into heavy topics. That would come later, with time. For now, it was enough to be together without hostility, without active resentment. Mrs. Roberts was waiting for them at the hospital, having taken the bus early in the morning. When Robert saw her, he immediately approached and extended his hand. You must be Mrs. Roberts. I'm Robert. I want to thank you for being there for my mum when I wasn't. Mrs. Roberts studied him with eyes that had seen much in life. Eyes that could detect sincerity or falsehood in an instant. After a moment that seemed eternal, she took his hand. Actions speak louder than words, young man. I hope you remember that. I will, Robert promised. And in his eyes, Hope saw that he meant it. The operation lasted 3 hours. Robert and Mrs. Roberts waited together in the waiting room, an unlikely pair united by their love for the same woman. When Dr. Hernandez finally came out, with a tired but satisfied smile on his face, they both jumped up from their seats. The surgery was a success, he announced. We were able to remove the entire tumor, and there was no metastasis. With proper care and follow-up, Mrs. Hope should have many more years of healthy life. Robert sobbed openly without shame, and Mrs. Roberts hugged him, her own tears mixing with his. The recovery was slow but steady, Robert took a week off work. The first time in years he had done that, to stay in St. Louis and be near his mother. He visited the hospital twice a day, bringing her fresh flowers and the magazines she enjoyed. More importantly, he talked to her. He truly talked to her, asking her about her life, her memories, her dreams. He listened in ways he had never listened before. One afternoon, while Hope was sitting in her hospital bed looking out the window, Robert asked her something that took her by surprise. "Mum, can you tell me about Dad? About how you met? What was he like? I realized I almost never talk about him, and I need to know that part of my history." And so Hope told him. She told him about Tom, about how they had met at a town fair when they were both 17 years old, about how he had been shy but persistent in his courtship, about how they had built a life together from nothing. She told him about the day Robert was born, about how Tom had cried with happiness holding his son for the first time. She told him about his father's kindness, his hard work, his love for the land and for his family. Robert listened with tears running down his cheeks, absorbing stories he should have known years ago, but that only now he was ready to truly hear. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said when she finished. "I'm sorry I forgot where I came from. I'm sorry I didn't honor Dad's memory by living the life he would have wanted me to live." "You can still do it," Hope replied softly. "You still have time to be the man your father would have been proud to call his son." A week after the surgery, Hope was discharged from the hospital. Mrs. Roberts had returned to Remedy Springs after the first few days, satisfied that everything was fine, but promising to have the house ready and clean for when Hope returned. Robert insisted that his mother stay with him and Vanessa in Chicago for another 2 weeks while she recovered completely. And this time, Hope accepted. Robert's house was just as Hope had imagined. Large, modern, elegant, full of expensive furniture and impeccable decor, but it also felt cold, empty of the warmth that comes from a house full of love and memories. Vanessa greeted her with evident shame on her face, but also with genuine kindness. "Mrs. Hope, I am so sorry about how we treated you before. There's no excuse for that. Please consider this your home." During those 2 weeks, something changed. The cold, elegant house began to feel a little warmer. Hope cooked when she had the energy, filling the modern kitchen with the aromas of homemade food that Robert had forgotten he loved. They shared meals together. They truly talked, slowly building bridges over the chasm that had opened between them. One night, while they were having dinner, Robert made an announcement. "Mum, I've been thinking. Vanessa and I have decided that we want to spend more time in Kentucky. I'm going to open a satellite office in St. Louis, and we're going to visit you regularly. I'm not saying I'm going to move back. Chicago is where my career is, but I need to be more present in your life. I need my future children to know their grandmother, to know their roots." Hope felt tears forming in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I would like that," she said simply. And she meant it, but she also knew, with a newfound wisdom, that her happiness didn't depend on it. If Robert kept his promise, it would be wonderful. If not, she would be fine anyway. Because she had learned that her worth didn't depend on being needed or loved by others, but on the strength and dignity she carried within herself. When she finally returned to Remedy Springs, she was greeted like a hero. The whole town seemed to know about her operation, her recovery, the reconciliation with her son. Donnie had put a sign on his store. "Welcome back, Mrs. Hope." The church organized a special Thanksgiving Mass for her recovery. But the most important thing was the moment she crossed the threshold of her humble house and felt completely at peace. This house, with its cracked walls and old furniture, was her home. Not out of resignation or lack of options, but by choice. It was where she belonged. The months that followed brought subtle but significant changes. Robert kept his promise, visiting once a month and calling every week. The visits weren't perfect. There were still awkward moments, old wounds that occasionally reopened, but they were real and honest. Vanessa accompanied him now, and the two women began to develop their own relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Hope also began to live her own life in ways she had never considered before. She joined a group of older women at the church who met to knit and share stories. She started taking reading classes at the traveling library, discovering worlds in books that she had never had time to explore when she was busy surviving. She cultivated her garden more carefully, filling it with colourful flowers that brought her joy every morning. And every night, before going to sleep, she looked in the mirror with her silver and blue stone earrings and smiled at the woman she saw reflected. A woman who had been broken but not destroyed, betrayed but not defeated, wounded but still capable of healing. A woman who had learned the most difficult lesson of all, that self-love was not selfishness, but survival. That setting boundaries was not cruelty, but necessity. That forgiving did not mean forgetting. A year after the operation, on a golden autumn afternoon, Hope was sitting in her rocking chair on the patio, knitting a small sweater, because Robert and his family had announced that they were expecting a baby and she would be a grandmother. The news had filled her with a complex joy mixed with hope and a little fear. Hope that this new being would bring more love into the world. Fear that history could repeat itself, that one day this child might also forget his roots. But then she reminded herself that she couldn't control the future. She could only live the present, do the best she could, love with wisdom rather than desperation. The sun began to set, painting the sky with the colours that had always seemed the most beautiful to her. Deep oranges, soft pinks, purples that gradually darkened towards the blue of night. And as the daylight slowly faded, Hope Stevens, a struggling survivor, a woman who had rediscovered herself at 73 years old, closed her eyes and smiled, because she had learned something essential. That the end of one chapter does not mean the end of the story, that a broken heart can heal in unexpected ways, that betrayal can teach valuable lessons, and that it is never too late to reclaim your dignity, to demand respect, to choose to live on your own terms. And as she closed her eyes, she felt that she was finally coming home again, not to the plaster and tile house where she lived, but to herself. After a lifetime of living for others, she had finally found her way back to her own soul, and in that return, she had found something more precious than all the love of her children or the approval of the world. She had found peace. If this story moved you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like so more people can hear stories like this. You can also support with a super thanks, which helps us continue sharing stories full of truth and emotion. And if you made it this far, write the word dignity in the comments to let us know that you were a part of this story from the first pain to the last forgiveness.